Hi, and welcome once more to the Allplane Podcast. Back here after a short summer break and ready to keep talking with the movers and shakers that are redefining the future of commercial aviation. As usual, before we start, let me remind you that all previous episodes of this podcast, as well as many other aviation stories, are available on the Allplane website. That's Allplane.tv, Allplane.tv. Today on the podcast, we have a sustainable aviation entrepreneur, Paul Perera. Paul's company, called Fluxart, is working on the development of cryogenic motors, a technology that aims to boost the performance of hydrogen-powered motors for aircraft by making them several times more efficient than they are now. But besides this facet as an entrepreneur, Paul is possibly one of the best informed professionals that I know in the whole sustainable aviation space. You will find him often on LinkedIn, for example, sharing many interesting insights and stories from literally from all corners of the sustainable aviation industry. So I wouldn't want to miss this opportunity to ask him about more general trends in the aviation hydrogen space, and most particularly in the UK, where Paul is based, since there are quite a few interesting projects going on there at the moment. So without further ado, let me welcome Paul to the podcast so that we can learn about all this directly from him. Hi, Paul. How are you?
Good, Miguel. How are you?
Very well. So you're joining us from one of Europe's capitals of aerospace industry, in the UK, in the Bristol area, Filton, where I think Airbus is located, and it's an important cluster as well for many other aerospace industries. And yeah, today we're going to talk about sustainable aviation. I must say you are one of the most prolific writers and sharers of information out there, I think, in the sustainable aviation space. I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself now and tell us a bit more about your background, but I think you are possibly one of the most knowledgeable people out there right now in this field. So, so welcome to the podcast, and please tell us more about yourself before we get into your projects and the general outlook.
Thank you, Miguel. And well, it's a pleasure being here and love reading your articles as well. And, sustainable aviation for me, as Paul Perera, the guy that 35 years ago turned up at the doors of Airbus to learn about how to do trades on sustainability, is now trying to put it into practice with my own little company called Fluxart. And I've taken quite a journey to sustainable aviation through companies, as you say, in Bristol, not just Airbus, but Rolls-Royce and GKN Aerospace, and work with some of the defense primes looking at sustainability as well, like BAE Systems. And what I've discovered in this time is really that there is no one silver bullet, as people say, but there are better bullets than others. And I think that I've been on a mission for at least the last 12 years to look at hydrogen significantly more than the others. And in that light, with Fluxart, what we're trying to do is build the best propulsion solution that we can and get that up into the skies as quickly as possible. And the reason, I have 5 children, a big carbon footprint of my own, and I need to reduce that for the future of the girls and their families. And I think that with the possibility of hydrogen, we have a change in the approach that we take to designing aircraft. We certainly have a different dynamic on the ground with aviation in airports, and the energy sector becomes much more closely aligned. And what we have to do is think about a systems of systems perspective, which is where my career really has been as strategy and technology VP or director in most of those companies. So I'm really pleased to offer my thoughts and continue to share.
Yeah, actually, there's so much I would like to ask you because, as I mentioned, I think you have a very good insight about everything that's going on in the field of green aviation at the moment. There are obviously different paths that are being pursued by different players, from electric to hydrogen to other types of technologies. You are particularly focused on hydrogen. We can look at the general outlook for hydrogen further down the road. But first of all, I would like to ask you about this particular project you are working on, Fluxart, because I checked the website. You mentioned cryogenic motors,
Right.
which I'm not totally sure I understand what they are, but there is not much more information out there. So could you please tell us a bit more about Fluxart, because it sounds really, really interesting in a sort of a mysterious sort of way. And it seems that you guys are up to something great. You mentioned that the technology you're working on can deliver very, very significant improvements in the field of propulsion. So
Fluxart was created about a year and a bit ago by 2 other co-founders and myself. Both have Strathclyde University. They're looking at superconducting motors. And why do we think that superconducting motors are important? Because we think that hydrogen is going to be in scarce supply for some time. And what we can do for a given amount of hydrogen is produce 4 times the amount of power. So what we think about is, how do you reduce the demand? Everything in our lives, when it's our houses, our heating, we should be looking at first to reduce demand on the supply of energy. So the first thing we thought about is, how do you do that? And the best way is to take a motor and make it more efficient and make it lighter weight, particularly for aerospace applications. And we do both of those things. So we can produce a motor that is 4 times the power density. That means 4 times the amount of power out for a given weight relative to existing technology that's out there, air-cooled, permanent magnet motors in particular. And when we look at the future opportunities, well, it doesn't just land with aviation. We've already talked to heavy goods vehicles, marine and shipping. If we can reduce the demand on the supply of hydrogen, that will then make that rare value of hydrogen spread wider whilst we still establish the future. The other benefit of a superconducting motor is you can get to very high power output. So we can get to 2 megawatts, we can get to 4 megawatts, and it scales and it's modular. And that's really important, because as we start to look beyond regional aircraft, we need to get into that 8 megawatt category. This is where we're at, and this is where we're trying to get to as soon as we can and accelerate that pathway.
So if I understood correctly, are we talking about fuel cell? What's the transmission here between hydrogen and...
Yeah, we could. Any generator that could produce electrical power effectively could be used, but our goal is to use the cryogenic temperatures. So a gas turbine burning liquid hydrogen would also be possible to be part of the propulsion chain. But more and more we look at what's the output of a gas turbine burning hydrogen, and we see NOx, we see further contrail effects, we see potentially some other concerns related to radiative forcing and greenhouse gas. When we look at the non-CO2 effects, the best option by far is a fuel cell. The difficulty with a fuel cell is the heat management and the thermal management associated with that. So we're also trying to address that by combining the heat exchanger that we'll be using for the cryogenic superconducting with the fuel cell heat exchanger, and get the added benefit of the two coming together, because you have a huge amount of low-grade heat for every megawatt of energy created by a fuel cell. You create a megawatt of heat, but it's at low temperatures, sort of maybe 80 degrees Celsius, which is difficult to deal with and dispose of. And that's what we need to work through, and that's what we're working on. We have a heat exchanger solution that we believe can pass that low-grade heat into a number of parts of the system and provide further benefits. So we really want to harness the cryogenic hydrogen, which is the main factor here, whether it's an electric generator off a gas turbine or whether it's something else. We can certainly use the cryogenic conditioning to help us build this superconducting motor.
At what state of development is this technology at the moment? Because it sounds like a very deep science type of project, but has it been tested like in a proper physical
Yes. The physical lab test at 10 kilowatts exists already, and we're going to 200 kilowatts. And the idea is to scale beyond there very quickly. So this is the approach that we're taking, a bit like start small with the Tesla with the Roadster, if you take it by example, and then they move to the Model X, and then and so on. So we begin to see an evolution of the pathway, but we think that needs to be accelerated. So we're not holding back. We're trying to attain additional grant and also private equity investment, and we've got a great team around us. We've just employed a colleague from my past. In fact, my first boss at Airbus, who ran the Future Projects Department, became most recently a member of the Fly Zero program here in the UK under the ATI, looking at the certification system aspects of a hydrogen-powered aircraft. And he's our engineering director. So we're building out a team that's very capable, understands the certification needs for aviation. We also have within the team myself, who's got manufacturing experience, and then obviously our 2 professors from Strathclyde who are joining us as full members of the team. And that really brings us to a position where we have world-leading expertise in manufacturing, certification, and obviously the superconducting motors themselves.
Hmm. So is this something that you are already building, from what I understand? So you have the lab and
It's already,
okay.
the team's already built the first demonstrator onto the second, and we were trying to find the money for the third. We built a heat exchanger with the Scottish Enterprises funding and grant earlier this year, which is a biaxial heat exchanger, which we've been able to demonstrate in the labs, but we want to get that to scale for a heavy goods vehicle as well. So we're beginning to look at a number of pathways to accelerate progress, because we can see aviation taking its time to adopt new technologies, but it's not the slowest one to move. Particularly here in the UK, we've got a more fertile ground than ever before, and obviously with clean aviation coming with a lot of money behind it, maybe in Europe we should be looking there too. We haven't started to, but we've got partners building out the heat exchanger with us. We've got a fuel cell partner. We've also got a tank provider as well. So all of those aspects are really important to the overall system. And the boundary of all of the cryogenics is contained within that system.
What are the challenges? It sounds amazing to be able to increase the performance so much, but I guess it's not so easy to do it in practice. No, there must be some technical challenges to overcome here.
There's actually more supply chain challenges. The superconductor material comes from places like Russia or for China. We need to bring that technology into the UK. There is a source in Germany and there is a source in the US, but they're far too expensive. Apart from that, the windings themselves, we have a very good experience of pulling those into the motor. And, the design for the purpose in an aviation sense and packaging, that's one thing that we still need to do. So it depends on the vehicle, it depends on the location of the propulsion train as to how we package. So the biggest challenge is finding an airframe integrator that wants to work with us to do this. And we're talking to a number, and some of the bigger ones, we can't name, but some of the smaller ones, we're talking to those that are already involved in hydrogen aviation. So you can probably guess who they are.
Assuming this works well as expected, what would be your place in the industry supply chain? So you see your business model, is it to become a supplier to the OEMs or to come up with some sort of retrofitting solution on its own? How do you see this going?
If you look what Airbus is trying to do, they're moving into fuel cells. They're moving into the space that the engine manufacturers have traditionally been producing power. So we have to ride with the industry on this one. But I think our goal is to make sure that the IP works and that the IP can be exploited in the aerospace sense. And we're looking forward to the next steps there within reason. We want to be up in the air within 4 years' time. So liquid cryogenic hydrogen in an aircraft flying with a superconducting motor in 4 years seems to be achievable from what we can see.
Oh, well, that 4 years for industry standards, that's quite a short time.
We're seeing, other programs, and the one I admire most is the Project Frescent in Cranfield, where they're taking a very measured approach to putting a fuel cell, heat exchangers, and then obviously gaseous tanks up in the sky with an Islander. And they've got a program of 3 years, and that seems to be working to plan. So, off the back of that, you've got a flying test bed. So you have the ability to convert that to liquid hydrogen. We're not saying that this would be a final retrofit solution. I have an opinion that retrofitting any hydrogen aircraft will be at some disadvantage to the original design mission of all those aircraft. So I think we're not really thinking about implanting this in an existing aircraft. It needs to be a test bed. And then we'll be looking for a new aircraft design that would incorporate the superconducting. And that might be 10 years away from here. But, the sooner the better.
And it can work with both hydrogen in gas and liquid form?
Well, the superconducting, no. Superconducting would need the cryogenic conditions.
Okay.
So we want to get that on board, and we think that that's the right way to go, because gaseous will probably take you up to 50 seats, but that's not where the biggest CO2 burn is occurring. To look at where the footprint of CO2 across the industry in aviation is coming from, you have to start looking to the lower end of the narrow bodies, up to about 150-seat market. That's where we want to target our application. So liquid hydrogen is the important piece of this jigsaw. So who are the players in this market? You have, obviously, we've had the CRJ, we've had the Embraers. We're into the space of the lower end of the A319, A318, this market, and obviously the A220. But if you look at those aircraft, they are by far and away a large emitter, and relative to the regional aircraft at the lower end, 56 and below, they're probably 10 times the amount of CO2 footprint. So we want to make sure that we have impact, and to do that, we have to go big. And going big means not the traditional motors, as far as we can tell. You have to use superconducting. And we've been working with a lot of world-leading experts in some of this area of sizing aircraft with some of those companies aforementioned. And they are very, very sure that the route from batteries that everyone was after 5 years ago, even Airbus looking at the E-Fan-X have moved to hydrogen. They moved very quickly through gaseous hydrogen straight to liquid. We think that will be the trend of everyone. You've seen Embraer doing the same. I think that's where we're heading. So liquid hydrogen is the need. And you might ask, where do we get liquid hydrogen from in quantity? And that's what I'm working on as well. So we're looking at how to produce liquefaction, because part of the liquefaction process is the heat exchanger. And the heat exchanger that we're developing for the cryogenics is very valuable for that liquefaction process as well.
So it could have other uses as well once you have it in liquid form. In terms of sourcing the hydrogen, that's another hot topic as well, because where is this hydrogen going to come from? From which sources? Is this an efficient use of energy to produce this hydrogen? That's another debate out there. So how do you see this whole topic? I mean, do you think it's going to be like the hydrogen economy is going to really become big, or it's just going to remain a niche for maybe, a niche. I mean, aviation is pretty big niche, right? But I mean, we're seeing other companies also pushing for hydrogen more generally in other areas of the economy. I don't know how much future do you see to this path?
Well, look, I mean, today hydrogen is produced largely from black or grey, which means it's from coal or from gas, without any capture of the carbon. And the first things first, there's a demand, there's a supply. We should try and green that supply. That's okay. But at some point, you need to decide where that green hydrogen that you produce should come from and where it should go to. And I think there has to be policy decision making along the way to help guide. Today, aviation represents only about 2.4% of global emissions. But let's add in the non-CO2 effects. We're probably at 9% reality. And then we compare very favorably with marine, in terms of, or unfavorably with marine. And marine, you can use alternatives, ammonia. So you don't need hydrogen, but you could produce ammonia from hydrogen, obviously, and it's needed in the process. So which way would it go? Marine, aviation, general transport. Definitely not general transport. If you can electrify it, we should electrify. However, heavy goods vehicles at 20 tons of logistics cargo are going to be very difficult for electric batteries. And don't forget, there's a huge footprint with electric batteries of CO2. And everyone forgets that. There's a second life we may be able to make of those batteries to extend their usefulness. But ultimately, we've got to recycle or reuse those, because what's being created in those batteries is CO2 footprint is quite significant, and there's a lot of work going on to look at those pathways as well. SAF, we've talked a bit around it, but the sustainable aviation fuels, where's the best source of SAF? My view, and it's based on some analysis, hydrogen also appears to be the best route to create SAF, so the power to liquid route. So whilst we've got demand growing in aviation and we've got scale, then we need to look to those people that can scale. Because I think one of the challenges, if I'm honest, is that there won't be enough carbon sequestration and carbon capture around to deal with every single source of carbon and push that under the ground, which is effectively what we're going to have to do. And by the way, it's very expensive. So the cost of SAF is 4 times that of kerosene, and that's not yet, unsubsidized. That's with subsidies. So hydrogen and green hydrogen, if renewables is the source, and we're looking only at green hydrogen at the moment for all our testing, we're using Octopus Hydrogen here in the UK, who are working with Zoravium and others. But we see that is the best route. Now, what does that need? It does need some policy nudges, and we definitely need more renewable sources of energy built very quickly. But that's happening, and that's beginning to shape up with the UK government and others committing to more and more renewables. And more green hydrogen will be produced. Electrolyzers are the key. And what we're seeing is electrolyzer costs coming down. The US have a very big ambition under the Biden administration, as we do in Europe now, and they've just released their Inflation Reduction Act to produce low cost clean hydrogen with low carbon. And what we've got in policy now is a huge commitment backed with money. And I think that's not just the money from government, but it's the follow-on money that comes from investors that's really interesting. Mm-hmm. So Breakthrough Energy that Bill Gates has created, puts down double the amount that Europe can put down. And we can find more sources of funding once this gets going. So I think money becomes less of the issue in creating the capacity. Then we need manufacturing capabilities. So the bottlenecks are disappearing, right? So green hydrogen, renewables, electrolysis, cost of manufacturing coming down, automation. We will find our way to $1 a kilo, I believe. I don't know when, but I believe we'll find it there. And at that point, grey hydrogen makes no sense. Blue hydrogen makes even less sense in some respects, because the cost of carbon capture is going to be extremely high, more than that $1 a kilo. And people will ask, well, hang on, how do you get to $1 a kilo for hydrogen? Because the cost of electricity is, more than that. And when you add the electrolyzer inefficiencies, but actually it's kind of reverse logic. The more renewables you build, the cheaper everything becomes when you get into the system. So you get to scale, the electricity costs come down, the electrolyzer costs at scale come down. We'll find ourselves in a position where we're not comparing today's prices of electricity. We'll be looking at much reduced prices. And then we add into the mix, well, where do we get that stable electricity from for the other sources that we need to provide? Nuclear is going to be one of those. So nuclear could be a part of the mix in creating cleaner hydrogen as well. So I think we're going to find a phasing of this. But between now and the end of the decade, I'm pretty convinced that green hydrogen for aviation will be a natural source.
The UK in particular, it's got a pretty active government support program for all things sustainable aviation. And as you mentioned earlier as well, there are other projects in the field of hydrogen. Why do you think it's so? I mean, do you think it's got good opportunity to become sort of a world leader in this new hydrogen economy? Where does the UK stand in, let's say, in this global push for hydrogen?
I mean, I hate to bring up the word, but Brexit has probably prompted the UK to do some things at a pace because the government has realised they have to sustain some capability in the UK, not least because of the economics, but because there's a huge industry here to protect as well. And Airbus, sitting in Europe, could pull that work and had threatened to pull some of that work into Europe. And I think you've seen this over the last week. In fact, only on Friday, the current Prime Minister went up to Broughton in Airbus and walked around the Treasury and the Welsh Minister to show the plant and said, look, Airbus is investing heavily. We're putting money into R&D. And there's a very significant drive from government, whichever flavour in this country, towards protecting the big community of 30, 40,000 people that are supported by the aerospace industry, and then all of the subsequent supporting industries that sit around it. And so I think what we have to realise is that the UK has been partly ahead of the pack in some respects in moving towards looking at different alternatives. And, I was part of the ATI's board for a time, which is the Aerospace Technology Institute. And I was pushing then hydrogen. And then we came up with a Fly Zero program, which ran for the best part of the pandemic. And that ran to 100 people looking at alternatives. And they didn't select hydrogen immediately. They went round and looked at ammonia, and they looked at SAF, and they looked at all the other comparators. And they found that liquid hydrogen was the best option. So what happened there, and you could see it in the news from Farnborough, that the likes of Rolls-Royce got convinced on hydrogen and now is planting their seeds of R&D money down. The government's going to support that with match funding, and you find that it's a very rich environment for investment in hydrogen technologies at the moment within the UK. They doubled their commitment to hydrogen research with a step up from 5 gigawatt ambition by the end of the decade to 10 during the first month of the Ukraine crisis, and said, look, for energy policy and security reasons, we need to go further. I just read the news today, and the Labour government here wants to do even more than that. So it's tending towards an acceleration towards the hydrogen economy, largely because of the situation we find ourselves in. But then, I don't think that's any different in Germany or in Canada. Or, there's a lot going on. So I feel like we're not the leaders. We're trying to play catch up. But by playing catch up quite so obviously, it looks like we're doing a lot more. I think the important thing is that we're all on the same race course. Are we all heading to the same aim? Because aviation is a global game, right? So do we have green hydrogen at hubs across Europe very soon? Because that's probably where we're going to see the kickoff of the hydrogen aviation economy. And that's what's most important, really, not which country takes the lead, but how do we help each other and how do we collaborate?
What's the time horizon that you see for the hydrogen power aircraft to come into the market in a significant way? For example, Airbus, that one that I think 1 year ago they announced with much fanfare. Is this realistic, or you think it's going to take a bit longer?
In two minds whether Airbus is telling us everything, right? So typically Airbus doesn't release everything that they're doing to the world. So what they did release over a year ago on Zero E is probably only part of what they're doing. And I think their actual aim is faster than 2035 to get aircraft into the sky. And I base that logic on the fact that you only have to look at their order book. They're trying to burn through it at now a rate increase from 55 to 75 single aisles a month. They want to get through, I think, and have a new capability available to start producing hydrogen aircraft in each of these zero emission development centers within the next 2 years. I think that the TRL level they want to get to suggests that they have very strong confidence that they're going to get to a hydrogen system that's going to fly, whether it be a gas turbine or a fuel cell, before the end of the decade. And then, the certification roadmap, hopefully by then we'll catch up with things and we'll be hitting 2035, if not before. The question is whether it's a gas turbine, whether it's a fuel cell, whether it's superconducting or non-superconducting. And I know where my bets are, but I think Airbus is taking quite a lot of bets. They're not stopping at one solution. They're keeping their aperture wide. Boeing, I think, is following. I think they were ahead in hydrogen, and they had experimental aircraft flying in Spain, as it were, I remember. And I think they're now in a place where they are putting that back on their Route 1 for a new aircraft as well. They've got SAF, but they're quietly playing into hydrogen spaces all over the place. So I think we'll see hydrogen appear in Boeing's portfolio again. And we know Embraer's plans there with their Energia aircraft. So I think that's very clear. They have a longer timeline and a horizon than I would imagine. Maybe that's because of money, because they have had the challenges of disruption with the Boeing failed deal. But perhaps they'll find themselves on their feet again and they might accelerate that pathway. But I have a feeling that they are probably the best aircraft manufacturer at the scale, benefit from hydrogen. So I think it's about them finding the evidence that they can get to the TRL levels quickly enough. And if money's behind it, I'm sure they will do. And then the unlikely ones, but they could come through. But the Chinese are massively investing in hydrogen. And I don't know where COMAC sits today, but I wouldn't leave them out of the race. They may be very slow at regulating an aircraft for a CAA or FAA or EASA approval, but they may bring the technology to the table. So I keep my mind open on the Chinese. They could move fast.
Well, either way, I'm sure we will learn through you at some point, because you are always one of the fastest to break news in this space on LinkedIn. And what other channels, what other sources should people check to learn more about these projects?
It's a good question. I do try and stick with using LinkedIn as a sharing mechanism, and I get lots of good feedback and hope that that's useful to people, which is nice to know that you find it. But where do I find my intelligence on things? I talk to people. I try and ask open questions and find out what's going on. And I like to share there because I get quite good response and feedback. And also, when I ask a question, we find that there's a lot of people who are informed who can actually bring their thoughts to the table. So it's a nice platform. But I see a lot of intelligence through conversations I have with people. For Fluxart, we have our own website, which is fluxart.aero, and we're trying to make that a little bit more active. We look at all sorts of sources. Obviously, we have podcasts that we listen to, like Allplane. We have the use of Twitter. We follow certain people that we believe are leading thinkers in the industry, but we also have some of those leading thinkers, our advisory. And we have the opportunity to talk to some of those people and get their insights. So whilst at Farnborough Air Show, we were able to meet with Grazia Vittadini and Val Mitkov, some of the key players, I believe, in hydrogen ambition.
Parenthesis here for people that are not familiar. Grazia Vittadini is the former Airbus CTO, and I think now she's at Rolls-Royce, if I'm not mistaken.
Exactly. Yeah.
And Val is the founder of Zero Avia, which is one of the leading companies in the field of hydrogen aviation. Basically, I've been posting about it quite a few times, and we had their CFO on the podcast quite some time ago. But I'm going to post a link in the notes as well for further context. Mm-hmm. Yeah, sorry, I'll just a quick parenthesis here.
There's also fantastic resources available that we find in feeds from news articles through the Twitter handles that people use. We use that very regularly. So also follow us on Fluxart1 on Twitter, and you'll find out a lot more about what we're seeing on the hydrogen aviation space. And I think the final thing to say is everyone can help accelerate this journey if we share more. There's a lot of opportunity to learn, and I think we all need to learn fast, because the hydrogen economy, whether it be in aviation or elsewhere, is definitely coming. So I'd welcome anyone's thoughts on that and feedback to me, and look forward to hearing from you all soon.
Definitely, we'll try to do our little bit here from this modest podcast to also share this knowledge and share all these advances. Very exciting times for the industry. Well, thank you very much, Paul. Speak soon.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Before you go, and if you like this podcast, a quick reminder that it would be absolutely great if you could please give it a rating on Apple, Spotify, or whichever platform you're using, or recommend it to a friend or whomever might be interested. Thank you very much, and see you soon.